Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, my fine friends. Welcome to a special bonus episode of the Tom Petty Project podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Brown, also joined by my co-host, John Paulsen. This is the podcast that digs into the entire Tom Petty catalogue, song by song, album by album, and includes conversations with musicians, fans, and people connected with Tom along the way. So following the Damn the Torpedoes review episode with John, a few people asked if we'd be going back to look at the first two records. And we decided that would be a fun thing to do. So sit back, relax, and enjoy two diehard Tom Petty fans talking about 1976's debut record, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. So thanks again for joining me, John. How are things out in California?
Pretty good. We're getting some decent weather right now, and it's an interesting time of year because we have a drought in California as well. So we're on water restrictions. But other than that, everything's good.
Water restrictions means like no sprinklers, can you shower?
You can shower. You just don't want to use your sprinklers. We have drip irrigation in our house now, but they can only blast the sprinklers like one time a week now.
Yeah, we get that occasionally here, but not so the last couple of years. We've had some pretty intense rain, and of course we get so much snow that it tends to make sure that we've got water for at least the first 2 or 3 months of spring and summer. So, okay, so Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, the debut album. I'll give you some vital statistics first, folks. It was released on November 9th, 1976. It was recorded on Shelter Records and distributed by ABC Records, and we'll be ended up talking about more about that later on the second album. The producer was Denny Cordell, who originally intended this obviously to be a solo project for Tom after Denny had basically dropped Mudcrutch as a project from the label, and of course the production was a little bit scattered and fractured. It was recorded at Shelter Studios, with Luna being recorded at the Church Studio in Tulsa. It comes in at a tight 30 minutes and 35 seconds. The singles from the album were Breakdown, which did not chart when it was initially released, Anything That's Rock and Roll, which hit at number 36 in the UK, and then American Girl hit number 40 in the UK. After John Scott's intervention, Breakdown was re-released, and then it reached number 40 on the Billboard charts, and of course the rest is history. Number 55 was the album position on the Billboard charts eventually, and it reached number 24 in the UK, peaking at number 18 in New Zealand, of all places. So, let's dig into the songs. So we talked offline a little bit, John and I, about whether we're going to go through song by song or whether we're going to sort of hone in on specific songs. And I think we're going to do the latter. So I wanted to talk about Stranger Than the Night. That was one of the first ones we sort of figured we'd talk about, John. So give me your thoughts.
Yeah, this is it's sonically interesting, and it is sort of the thing that struck me about it was the lyrics. If you go back and look at the lyrics, it's about two men having a fight. One is black, one is white, and it's really pretty raw especially for Petty at that point in his career. I mean, this is on his first album, and he's kind of writing about violence, and so to me, it's a little bit of a turnoff lyrically, but I can see the appeal of the way it's structured and musically how it sounds, because it is a kind of I like the guitar a lot, but it's not one that I would go seek out to listen to.
Yeah, and I found that too, and I think I even commented on the album on the episode that it really is quite abrasive. Like, it's a shocking lyric, especially because I think it's one of the very few songs that has a quote unquote curse word in it. But I think that you sort of need that in there because of the subject matter. And I know that we talked about on the Torpedoes episode, I can't remember, maybe it was Century City. You'd mentioned too that you don't really dig those sort of aggressive lyrics or those stories, which I find kind of curious. Is that something that you avoid generally in music, or is it just a Tom Petty thing that you find it a little bit more jarring?
I think with Petty, I'm not used to him being real negative,
right,
or kind of writing songs. I'm not saying, I think Century City, I think he was writing it a little bit out of despising Century City. I don't know if hate's the right word. He said he hated Century City or hated those days going to talk to lawyers and stuff. But this one is like, this is not, I wouldn't, if this song was a little more interesting, a little catchier, I probably wouldn't feel exactly the same way about it. But I probably,
right.
You're talking about looking at the album critically, looking at the songs critically, and why don't I listen to this album more? And this is like one of the reasons is it just doesn't, some of these album tracks don't really grab me in a positive manner.
Well, I think the other thing about it too is, looking back again, it's not really a Heartbreakers song. Because it was Jeff Gerard on guitar, Emery Gordy on bass, Jim Gordon on drums. So that's still in that phase where it was Cordell's idea to have Tom be, a solo artist with different session musicians on different tracks. So I think it sounds and feels different to most of the rest of what's on that album, and certainly what came after. And I wonder that, if Jimmy Iovine or Rick Rubin had got their hands on something like that, I bet it would have sounded a hell of a lot different. I think it would have been produced completely differently.
Yeah, I think he's trying to make a comment about racism. I saw, a story about it, or an article about the article, and it kind of implied that it was a former slave confronting his former master, which I didn't really get the first listen, but I guess you could see it that way. Yeah. They really it didn't seem like it was clear. So that just made it, to me, it seemed like it was just sort of racial violence, and you didn't know why these two people were, fighting. So yeah. I think part of that was I was a little confused by the lyrics, and it's just not something I'm typically used to with Tom Petty, especially his early stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's a lot of that on this album. It's a collection of songs rather than being a cohesive album as we get into Torpedoes and Our Promises. But so anything that's rock and roll, I know that it caused a little bit of a stir when I rated this a 5 on the Nation, and I think looking back, I think that is too low. And I only went with a 5 for this one because musically it's the least interesting song on the album, I would say, because it's just a really straight rock and roll song. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just so simple that, and I love it. And it's on my playlist, and I listen to it lots. But I just thought, well, quality-wise, when you stack it up against some of those other songs, I don't see it in the lyrics. Again, fairly straightforward, and anything that's rock and roll, it's a bit of a sort of it's not really cock rock, but it's that kind of very simplistic idea. So that's where but I think really I should have probably put it as 7. I think a 7 at minimum would have been. So give me your thoughts. Where did I go wrong?
Yeah, this is one that, as I listened to this album several times to try to prepare for the podcast, this is part of the process that I like about doing this podcast with you, is that I'm discovering some songs that I like off these albums that I didn't, maybe the first few times I listened to them, I didn't really jump out at me, but yeah. I knew anything that's rock and roll was one of his singles, or one of their singles from this era. And, I went back and looked at the Running Down the Dream section, from the first album, them talking about it. And one of the performances they did, live performances on the Running Down the Dream doc, was anything that's rock and roll. And I think the live performance is even a little bit better than the studio performance. And it made me like the song more. And I kind of understood maybe why they had a reputation for being a little bit of a punk band, because it does have a little punk energy to it. And this is one where I could picture the Ramones covering this like sped up a little bit, and it would really work on one of their albums. So I just think it's a pretty good rock song, and one of the better songs on the album.
Yeah, for sure. And going back to that, I've been trying to sort of be consciously, when I'm reviewing the songs, reviewing the way that they're recorded on the albums. Because again, I mean, they changed and improved so many of their songs live, just in very subtle ways. So I've tried not to do that, but I think, and I always try and comment on live performances when I hear good ones. But yeah, again, I mean, and certainly live, when you see it live, I'm sure you've seen it live multiple times. It's going to be one that gets people off their seat too, right?
Yeah, it's up tempo, and it's a good little jam, and I can see why they played it on that first tour. They did it it was a live performance on a television show, and they picked it, and they also picked it as a single. So I think they knew that it was decent, or at least decent to good, and they have a way of elevating their studio tracks, and and then the live shows they can make them even better.
Totally agree. Okay, well, let's get into the top end. What about Breakdown? Track number 2 on the album.
Yeah, track number 2, just a 10 out of 10 song. Got a great groove to it. The descending guitar riff is really appealing. I like the story behind it, where they played the track for 8 or 9 minutes in the studio, and then sort of listened back to it and picked out the good parts. And that descending guitar riff that I believe Mike plays, became the crux of the song. And they apparently, Tom was in the studio at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., and he called the band back up to come back and record. And that's how hungry they were. They all came in at like 2:30 in the morning to record the official version of the song. It's also one that my son played in his School of Rock bands a couple of times. And it's great to hear him. When he pulls out his electric guitar, he's still playing. He's going to be playing in high school, which is cool. And he pulls out, and I asked for Breakdown, and he can still play it pretty perfectly, which is really cool. So it's one of my favorites. It's obviously one of his greatest hits. It was their first single. You said it didn't chart, which was interesting, but there's just not a lot of momentum behind the album at that time. And then once there was a little bit of momentum, it did end up charting, and it's obviously one of the favorites. And it wasn't one that he would always play in concert. That was usually on the set list, but there were some tours where they didn't play it.
Yeah, and it was the song that John Scott used to sort of, okay, no, you guys, you need to play this band. You need to play this band. And again, you think about, oh, they're a punk band, and the leather jacket and all that kind of stuff gives the wrong image. But as soon as you hear that second track, that should blow that preconception away completely, because this is I said in the episode, it's a slowed down blues shuffle. There's nothing punk. It's barely even a rock song, right? Really, until you get into the live versions where they jazz it up a bit. But it's such a slow, moody swing to it that, yeah, it's just absolutely fantastic. It blew me away. I remember listening to it the first time. Like, that's one of the few songs that I can distinctly remember listening to of Tom's for the first time and thinking, wow, that's just a different level of musicianship. And it's off the first album. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, and I would add that the live version on Pack Up the Plantation is really good. I might have mentioned this on the other podcast, but the fans take the first verse and he just lets them do it. And the other thing I like about Tom is that when fans would do that sort of thing, some bands would just go to the second verse to get the song over with, but he started over and sang the whole song. So I'm glad he didn't cheat the audience out. But that's and then there's that whole segue or towards the end where he starts talking and kind of freaking out and saying he's going to handle it like a man, and that whole thing's great, because there's a bunch of those on on YouTube, different performances of breakdown where he sort of freaks out towards the end, and it's always something a little bit different.
Yeah, it's a jam song, right? So and I think that when we talk eventually about Dog on the Run, maybe I think that's maybe why that song doesn't stay in the set list, because you've got Breakdown that does that. That's your 9-minute jam where you can really sort of have fun and experiment, right? So, okay, so American Girl, the last track. You leave this one to track 10.
Yeah, I mean, you listen to this and it's just a classic, 5-star, 10 out of 10 rock song. It's on all sorts of 4th of July playlists. It just is a perfect song. Like, I wouldn't change a single thing about it. And that's the thing that's so perplexing about it, is that they put this 10th on their debut album. And I don't know I would love to hear what the thinking was behind that and how much thought was actually put into it, because they did release it as a single. So they knew they had something. Or maybe it was when they started playing it live and the fans responded to it and they decided to, release it as a single. But I just don't know how you put that song last on the debut album, when the whole idea is to break out and to get people to listen to the types of songs you're able to write. And that's, as you're writing it, that has to be one of your best songs on the album, right?
You would think so, right? And I mean, especially that middle 8, that bridge in this song, it's still one of my favorites in not just any Tom Petty song, but any song. It slows right down and you get that really cool, again, it's that shuffle groove kind of thing going, and then it breaks back out and it's such a big break back into that strumming pattern. It's just glorious, right? It's really uplifting. And so, yeah, to leave it at the 10th that's just insane.
Yeah, this one I never get sick of hearing it. It comes on, you listen to it. I've not ever skipped this song when it came on the radio or one of my playlists or anything. It's just one you always listen to.
Yeah, agreed. And I think either we talked about this or I talked about this with someone else. Like, I don't really listen to Bohemian Rhapsody much anymore by Queen, and I don't really listen to Stairway to Heaven very much by Zepp, but just because I know those songs so well, they're just in there. But American Girl is in that same sort of territory, and I think it's one that some people might think is overplayed on rock radio. But same thing, if it comes on, it's just such a fun up song that, of course, I'm going to listen to it. And it's not a long song either, right? It's 3:20, 3:30 something. So gets in, it gets out, does its job.
Yeah, and that's one, they would close just about every show with it, and they would do an extended version. Typically, the last minute of the show is just them going crazy on the guitar and, before kind of wrapping it up. But they would definitely extend that one. That was another interesting thing about this album, is that everything is super, super short, and there's some weird fade outs that we're not going to talk about all these songs, but there's some, just as the song is sort of getting going and you're expecting another verse, they're fading out. And I don't think they knew how to end a song at this point in their career. They were just sort of fading out to move on to the next thing.
Well, I think too, though, that's possibly comes a little bit down to Denny as well, right? So that's that idea that you've got this breakdown could have been, even the album cut could have been 5 minutes, but you've got a producer there saying, well, no, if you want hits on the radio, you got to bring that back into sort of that 3-minute, 3.5-minute range, which was typical at the time, right? So,
yeah, and I think he was just trying to get them through the album. That's why it was like 30 minutes. You know, it's so short. They just want to get in and get out.
Yeah, for sure. Well, studio time's expensive too, right?
Yeah.
Fooled Again, which I think is probably my favorite quote unquote deep cut from the album, and sort of how he vocally sort of tortures those vowels. Like he just really leans into bending those vowels, and the drums are really mixed high and flat. And the thing that really does it for me on this one is that break into the chorus. Is that looks like I'm a fool, and that really just punches that word in, right? And then again, that sort of that high organ note. It's so cool. Sonically, I think it's one of the best on the album.
Yeah, and it's one of his best vocal performances, and I do like it when he's angry about love.
Yeah,
and freaking out about love or being dumped, because it just seems like that's a common theme in his rejection in his especially his early stuff. I think first 3 or 4 albums. This, I would say, I'd probably put this fourth. And you know, the other one that I like that's sort of a mid-tempo jam is Wild One Forever.
Yeah,
I think those two, like I started looking back through his career, and there's just a lot of these mid-tempo songs that were never really big hits, but they're so good. And he changes things up in the middle of them, and they're just, I don't know that he ever wanted to release a lot of these as singles, you know, but later on, you know, It's Good to Be King, Room at the Top are examples, but early on, like the Wild One Forever, Fooled Again, Insider, Surrender, these are not fast-paced songs or upbeat songs, but they're so good. And this is where I really get into my happy place when it comes to, you know, working with these playlists with Tom Petty, is that you can switch it up between these mid-tempos, these up-tempo, and then he's got the acoustic ballads or just slower ballads that are so good as well. So I think this is the one area where a lot of people don't know these deep cuts, that just sort of know him superficially, would probably really get into some of this stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And you talked there about Surrender, and of course we talked about that on the Torpedoes episode, and that was recorded, you know, several times in different forms, and they just obviously couldn't get it to a point where they loved it. But the 76 version that was recorded during these sessions is a lot more raw. Like it's a lot, the guitars just feel a lot heavier. But again, it's such a good song that I listen to that and I stack it up against some of the, what I would call weaker tracks, or you know, there's only probably a couple maybe off this album. And I think that I'm surprised that one didn't make it, rather than say Rockin' Around With You, you know?
Yeah. I went back and listened to the 76 version, and then again to the version off of Damn the Torpedoes sessions, the deluxe version, and I do prefer the second version, the Damn the Torpedoes version. I think the vocals are better, but you hit the nail on the head that the vocals in that 76 version are really raw. So if you like that, that's a cool version to sort of add to this playlist if you wanted to add something, swap out a song or something. But I just think that they did a really good job. I think I don't know if they overdubbed his vocals or there's backing vocals on that Damn the Torpedoes version, but it just appealed to me a lot more. And they do sound like more polished as a band, certainly by that time in the third album.
Yeah, and again, Iovine really, you know, that's when you get a really hands-on producer who's invested in the sound of the album as a whole, rather than just let's get it out the door, which again, we talked about with Denny Cordell. That's probably the case of we just need to finish this record. We need to get this out, right? So, and I think that shows, and it's good to have one song that was recorded at 2 different times so that you can do that side-by-side comparison, right?
Yeah, and there's a live version too, which is really good. I think it's on the live anthology. I may be mistaken, but Tom introduces the song as the song that they wrote back in 76 or a long time ago, something like that. And we never recorded it. And I think it was Stan that piped up and said, we never recorded it well. And then they kind of go into the song. I think they just never got a version that they were happy enough with to put it on one of these albums, which is kind of amazing, because especially that Damn the Torpedoes version, I think is definitely worthy.
Yeah, it's that perfectionism, right? I mean, it's that sort of thing where for the layperson, you think, well, this is brilliant. Like, why wouldn't you put, well, I don't think it's quite up there. Like, holy moly. And I suppose really when you've got the quality of songs that you write consistently, you can be a little bit more selective and a little bit picky. But let's get into being producer for a day. I wanted to run this by you. I've sort of put together the way that I would sequence this album, which is completely different to the way it was sequenced. And that happens less often as time goes on, because obviously Tom started to pay really close attention to that and got very good at it. So lead with American Girl. I think, like we talked about this already, I think that just has to be your opening track because it just showcases the brilliance of the band and the songwriting. Number 2, I'd go in with Breakdown. Leave that at number 2 because it gives you a different flavour. It gives you a different look at, the breadth of songwriting. I'd go Mystery Man for 3, which sort of keeps that vibe from Breakdown more or less. Wild One Forever and Anything That's Rock and Roll. So we kind of keep those two, I think, in the same places. Side 2, I'd open with Luna because, again, it's super interesting. I think it gives you that, this is different from everything else on the album so far. I'd go to Hometown Blues then to pick the pace back up. Put Stranger in the Night in at number 8. Fooled Again at 9, and then I'd go with Surrender. I'd finish with that 76 version of Surrender. That would be my sort of 10, and I would leave Rocking Around With You, which might be sacrilege to some people, but it's one of my least. I don't dislike this song, but it's definitely one of my least favorite Tom Petty songs. So that's my track order.
Yeah, and I just quickly put one together this morning, but I would like to listen to this in sequence and see how it sounds. Just one note on Rocking Around With You is that they very interestingly opened all of their 40th anniversary shows with it. And I was like, looking at set lists ahead of the time, I was like, why are they? And then I realized, that's their opening song on their opening album. And then you mentioned that they would close with American Girl, which is the last song on their opening album. So the bookends there are very, very cool. I don't know that I would get rid of Rocking Around With You. I think I'd want to put, if I had the option, I'd put Surrender on Damn the Torpedoes. Okay. So we don't have a lot of B-sides and stuff to work with this one. And I realize that the OGs out there are probably thinking this is sacrilege, but these albums, especially these early albums, are not as precious to me as they are to some other Tom Petty fans that were there at those early shows and really got into him early. So just let us, we're doing our best over here. This is a fun process for us. But so I think if I were producing, if I were Denny, I would say you need this first side of this album to be the best 5 songs you can put forth, or at least 4 with something interesting. So what I would do is American Girl, Breakdown. I would do the same thing, 1 and 2. I think that right there, if you're a DJ and you're looking for an album to play, and you listen to American Girl, you're going to listen to number 2, and then you hear Breakdown. Now this is a band that you're really trying to pay attention to, and you're going to give them some publicity and some airtime. Then I would put Wild One Forever 3rd. I think it is a little bit similar to Breakdown in that it's a mid-tempo, but I think it's also such a great vocal performance that it would really like, oh wow, this is a 3rd really good song, 3 in a row to start this debut album. Pay attention to this band. Then I think anything that's rock and roll would be a good 4th to pick up the pace again. And then to close the side, I think Luna would be a cool closer, because then you can kick it over to side 2 and start with like Fooled Again.
Okay.
And, maybe Mystery Man. I think the issue for me with Mystery Man and Hometown Blues is that they don't sound like they're, to me, part of the sessions that brought us the other 8 tracks. So I know that they have this Southern country rock background. Mudcrutch was very much a country rock band, or, Southern rock band. Yeah. And they were sort of trying to transition into this Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. So having Mystery Man and Hometown Blues on the same side of the album is a little bit sketchy to me. I don't know, but I don't think I'd want to have either one of those on the front side, because if you're trying to establish these guys as like the premier rockers of the late 70s getting into the 80s, those both seemed sort of to me like second side type track. So I would go with Fooled Again, Mystery Man, Rockin' Around With You, Stranger in the Night, and close with Hometown Blues. I think that this is one of those albums where there isn't a great closer to me. That's perfect. I mean, maybe Luna, but I think I like Luna as a closing on side 1.
Right on, man. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point too, because I think the reason that they do sound, some of those tracks do sound so different again, is because there's different people playing on them. They're recording with sort of different, and I think they were recording in a couple of different studios. I don't think they all were recorded at Shelter. Luna was obviously recorded over at Church, but I think there was some stuff was recorded at a studio in LA as well. So you get that sort of fractured thing going on. Plus, again, the idea that this is a Tom Petty album. No, now it's the Heartbreakers, so you get that transition, and I think it does make for a bit of a disjointed feel overall. And this is what I sort of commented, it's gloriously messy, right, from a cohesion standpoint. But I think that it does do a good job of showcasing. There's a bunch of different types of songs that Tom can write. He's not, for a debut album, a lot of debut albums, they sound very similar because bands sort of, like you said, I mean, they play their top 10 live tracks. Well, there was stuff that they were playing live with Mudcrutch and other songs that they didn't put on this album. But to sort of say, well, these are all different types of songs we can play. And they are definitely produced even differently, right? I mean, you can hear the production is different on some of the drums don't all sound the same. The guitars don't sound the same. It's kind of all over the place. But I think it's interesting for that.
Yeah, and I think it's an album where the band is trying to find their voice. Tom is trying to find his songwriting voice, and there's I think it's a perfect intro because there's moments of absolute brilliance where American Girl Breakdown. If you started the album that way, that would have put them on the map. I think. I don't know how you're a DJ in 76 or 77 and you hear American Girl and Breakdown and don't want to play that album or play that band. So
totally agree.
Yeah. I'm glad it all worked out the way it did, and his talent superseded a slow start. But I think the slow start would have been avoidable.
Totally agree. Okay, so let's talk then about our top 3 songs. So we did this for the Damn the Torpedoes episode, and we landed on exactly the same song. So I'm kind of curious to see if we do the same. So I'll let you go first, and then I'll tell you what my 3 are. So
yeah, I think we'll probably differ on one because I think American Girl Breakdown are, they have to be on there. And then for me, the third best song is The Wild One Forever. It's one that even before going back to listen to this album a lot, this is one I knew and I always had on my playlist and my deep cuts playlist and my box sets that I quote unquote box sets that I make up for Tom. And that it's such a great track. And I think it's so underrated. And I've heard him play it a few times live and it's just amazing. His vocal performance is amazing. So that's the third one I would put on there. So American Girl Breakdown and then The Wild One Forever.
When The Wild One Forever had commented, I think on the Night Watchman episode from Hard Promises, that because Hard Promises was really when he started getting heavily into the storytelling side of his songwriting. But Wild One Forever definitely is, I think, the sort of the intro into that, right? It's definitely got there's a bit of a narrative there. It's not as strong as some of the other stuff that he's written, but the narrative is there, and you kind of get this sense that he's actually really talking about someone here. This isn't just sort of an abstract idea. This really happened, sort of thing. And it turns out that it did, right?
Yeah, and the first minute of it, just him getting into his vocal is just incredible. And I also just like the song title, like the Wild One, Forever. I think is just a cool song title, especially for like one of your first songs that you've written, releasing on an album. Super
cool. Yeah, so we do differ. So yeah, obviously my top 3, American Girl Breakdown, as you said, that's just an absolute no-brainer. And there are a few albums where that's the case, where we're going to say, well, we know 1 and 2 for sure, and I think we're not going to differ too much. We might get more interesting when we get into things like Mojo and Wildflowers and some of those albums because there's so much to choose from. But yeah, I would go American Girl Breakdown, and then for me, Fooled Again, just because I like how different that one is. It's so, again, it's so jarring that that draws me in, and I like that sort of. The subject matter is interesting, and again, it's so different to pretty much anything else he wrote ever in his career, right? So that's my 3, so I'll go for those 3. So we've differed, finally, thankfully.
Yeah, that's a good, if you put that on an EP there, that's a good 4-track summary of this album, I think, and keep people interested in it.
I would say so. I'll put our top 3 playlists, and I'll do an EP. I'll do a T-Path EP, that'll be a good one, 4 tracks. All right, any final thoughts on the debut album?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I've gone back, this is not a precious album to me. This was always an album, their debut, that had 2 amazing songs that I've loved for years and years and years. And then The Wild One Forever, I think, and Fooled Again, I think, permeated my playlist and stuff for a dozen or so years.
Yeah.
But going back and listening to it, there are some, and also just like looking at the live performances of some of these songs, like anything that's rock and roll, remembering Rocking Around With You, and at the 40th anniversary tour. So this album has definitely like raised the stakes a little bit for me, or it's kind of gone up in my I don't want to say rankings, but I like it a little bit more, and it's something that I might turn on once in a while now, as opposed to something that I would sort of skip over and pick something else.
Yeah, for sure. And for me, it was sort of, I talked about it on the very first episode I ever did, that my introduction to Tom Petty, when I went back and started listening to the catalogue, when I threw this record on, I think the variety and the lack of cohesion actually drew me in. That was one of those things that was like, oh, well, this is interesting. I wonder how he got from there to Full Moon Fever. You know what I mean? Like, it's that thing of, well, that's a very different artist and it's a very different sound. So I want to, now I'm curious, now I want to see this evolution. So I think that it did its job in sort of piquing my interest, right? So.
Yeah, I think just one other thing is that I think when you look at the books and the various documentaries and stuff, and I think a lot of artists are like this. Once they put out an album, they don't spend a lot of time thinking about it or analyzing it. It's just kind of done because they got the pressure of putting out their next album. And I think he looks back at some of these. He doesn't look back necessarily at the album as a whole. He looks back at certain tracks and he has memories about certain tracks and things that worked for him and things he kind of regrets, but he doesn't spend a lot of time talking or thinking about it. Somebody has to prompt him to do that, I think. And it's interesting to hear some of his, when, you ask him about sort of an obscure track from his first album, that he's got some memory of it and how it all happened. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And speaking to Paul, he said that, that he would, Tom was such a professional when Paul was writing that book, that Tom would want, well, what songs are we talking about today? And he would go back and he would sort of dig out any sort of memories he could, or see if there was any notes anywhere lying around or any sort of old lyric sheets. And he would go back in detail and think, oh yeah, no, I remember that now. And that was, this person played this and we had this was going on. And so that's super cool, right? I mean, again, to be able to do that for a catalogue as wide as Tom Petty's, it's a big ask,
That's the coolest thing about that book to me, is I love hearing about how these songs were written and it's sort of memories of those songs. I mean, it's great to hear the story of the artist, and we got that in the documentary and stuff, but having a paragraph about his memories about every song is really, really cool.
Absolutely. And again, for my podcast, it's, if that book doesn't exist, my job is a lot harder, right? So okay, we'll wrap. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers here, and I'm not going to do a long outro for you folks. So that's all for this episode. And if you are enjoying these album wraps, come talk to John and me on social media. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at The Tom Petty Project, and on Twitter at Tom Petty Project. And you can find John on Twitter at 444_John, and that's number 4, FOR, number 4_John. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want to come and abuse us for wrecking the track listing, or you think we've done a bad job of that, come talk to us, because we want to have that conversation. And we'll see you next time to talk about the second album, You're Gonna Get It.